Hey y'all, Hestum. I hope y'all are having a great day. I know everything's been kind of different, from transferring all these things into Zoom, but luckily it does open up for some extra conversations between people like, normally me and Dr. Blaylock would not be able to kind of do these kind of presentations. And so really exciting to be here. Hestum, that's the way we say hello. Ni Rel Muk Wintu Choki Ambus. My tribe is from Hayfork, California. Right now, I'm actually talking to you on Miwok and Maidu land. I'm in Sacramento area right now. And yeah, I am a professor at Chico State. I focus heavily on federal recognition. My tribe is not federally recognized. And NAGPRA, the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act. Today's conversation and presentation is going to be focused on the article I co-wrote with Brittany Arona, who's also Hupa. And we talk about NAGPRA in a way from that's very different than what's often taught. We talk about NAGPRA coming from a Native perspective and making California specifically a white possession, and really excited to kind of get through the meat of this presentation. So yeah.
Fantastic. Welcome, Dr. Esquivido. We're really looking forward to our chat today. So let's start off with a little bit of background on, Native objects, Native bodies, and NAGPRA.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. So the research portion of this is focused in, and it's highlighted here. And as Dr. Blaylock just said, right, why are basic human rights not afforded to Native peoples in regards to our deceased, and going beyond that, not just our deceased, but artifacts, our material culture, our sacred objects. And if you don't know what we're talking about, let's give you some context, right? So thinking about ways in which Native peoples, Native tribes have often been powerless in returning our ancestors back, returning our culture back to us. But why was it taken in the first place, right? And that's the question that is often not asked. It's assumed and it's normalized. Why, we're on display in museums, why museums have these things. But the question really isn't asked, why do they have them in the first place? And so a lot of Native American studies, I'm sure Dr. Blaylock does the same thing, right? Leans on decolonizing methodologies, which one of the first books that came out popping, y'all, just came out Linda Tawahi Smith, highly recommend this reading. And for the old school people out in the audience, I use the first book cover. Anyways.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a weird flex for academia. We're nerds. It's okay. Anyways, so thinking about this as a memorialization of the nation state, and the nation state, what I mean by nation state, I mean the United States, right? So imperialism tends to be used in at least 4 different ways when describing the form of European imperialism, which started in the 15th century. So, this is nothing new. Imperialism was an economic expansion, right? So wanting to get that money. Imperialism as a subjugation of others, right? So oppressing, continual oppression of, an example here, Native peoples. Linda Tawahi Smith is Maori, so she's coming from a Maori perspective, but we are using her perspectives on Indigenous, on Native Americans here in the United States. And then 3, imperialism is an idea or spirit of knowledge. And that's something that we're going to continue to talk about in this presentation as well, right? This idea that continues to be perpetuated. And imperialism, this is number 4, I forgot to put the 4 in there. Imperialism could be tied to a chronology of events related to discovery and conquest, exploration, distribution, and appropriation. So thinking about it in a chronological order, like things happen sequentially. I can't say that word.
Sequentially.
There we go. Right, but how time will be considered linear, right? Always kind of adding on to, instead of thinking about it in a different lens. So yeah. Let's get to it. I use these 2 quotes a lot in my presentations when I talk about NAGPRA, when I talk about returning things from museums and how we end up getting there. And so I use this from an anthropology book that is an important critique of public museums, talking about the imperialism that's happened. They were born during the age of imperialism, often served and benefited capitalism, and continues to be instruments of the ruling classes and corporate powers. And I know that sometimes that's going to come to a lot of people as a shock. It came to me as a shock. You know, I grew up here. I grew up in Sacramento. I grew up in California, and I love museums. I was always taught that museums were a beautiful place to go and learn. And, you know, I mean, how many field trips have we been to museums? Right?
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, and so when you really feel like, wait, this feels uncomfortable, it made me feel uncomfortable too when I first started learning these things, right? So museums are cannibalistic in approaching other people's material for their own study and interpretation, and they confine their representations to a glass box display cases. Dr. Blaylock, what do you think about that?
Oh, wow. So yeah, listening to you speak, there's so much to unpack there. I feel like we could spend probably a whole presentation unpacking, what it means to interact with or be within a museum, to be within that space, or even just the process of museums collecting and displaying others' objects, bodies, knowledge. But I think for me, I'll just share real briefly. I grew up in a place that was super rural, so I actually didn't really have exposure to museum practice until I was in college. At least not, a ton. It wasn't a huge part of my experience in K-12, but I always actually found them kind of like an uncomfortable place. And it was really interesting that what it took for me to break out of that was actually taking a museum studies course with an anthropology professor who I really trusted. And in that course, we actually partnered with a dozen Maori artists and artisans who came over, and it was one of only two museums that displayed this eternal thread exhibit in the United States. And so we partnered very closely with the museum director, and then these dozen artists who came over, and they were in residence with us for 2 weeks. And it really took that experience of seeing what collaboration in museums could truly look like in a reciprocal way that was not cannibalistic, as you speak of, for me to begin to find some comfort and begin to find like the really positive things that could build out of relationships between museums as institutions and communities.
I love that example, like so much, because really that's, I think, kind of the heart of what they're saying here too, right? Like
Yeah.
this representation, or this, that they're using the narrative, right? The
Hmm.
museum, the colonial perspective as a narrative without using the narrative where they come from, the objects come from.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying, bringing in the Maori people, bringing in the cultural exchange, and then it often, I'm not often, it always will benefit everyone more to have that
Yeah.
representation. So why isn't
Yeah.
this normalized? Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you
we
so
we
much.
always learn more from each other, like in conversation, in dialogue. So
Exactly. And of course, where would any presentation be without James Luna? If you don't know who James Luna is, um, I
now
promise
you
you,
know.
now you know, but I promise you it's a good Google. Anyways, um, look at this huge snack on your screen. James Luna, love him. Anyways, he is a Laseno, native Mexican American person, and he does performance and multimedia installation as an artist. He does all kinds of different kinds of art forms. So when you look them up, it's fantastic. But I know sometimes I do harsh pivots, and you're like, wait, I thought we were talking about museums. Now there's a guy with a whip. It's okay. Just stick with me, y'all. James Luna's one of his famous installations is this piece. And when I present this piece, I usually ask my students, or the students in the present, or watching, what do they see in this? And so what they often say is, he's in a museum display case. And when James Luna did this presentation, he did this installment, people didn't bat an eye People would walk up and look, read the things on the case, right? The display, the labels, and keep moving. So the problem here is that this is normalized to have Native bodies on display and no one think twice about it. We're expected to be here. It doesn't shock anybody that we're here, but we don't see any other bodies anywhere else in this way. The only other example oftentimes used is mummies, right? And which also is horrific, right? To have bodies on display, I don't know what that says. I mean, it says a lot, but and then yeah, he would sometimes sit up and like scare the people in the museum, and it's a great story if you want to watch it, but it's also really heartbreaking when I see this. And so I love to use this perspective because this is a person that did this not that long ago. This isn't that old. And so oftentimes when, you know, Native American studies is taught, or if you go to a museum, we're often set in what? The past, right? It's a long time ago. And so I will continually make reference to that this was not that, this was within the, what, last 20 years he did this presentation, I would say 15. I don't know, maybe a little bit more than 10, but anyways, right? Like that it's not that long ago that we could do this presentation right now or this installment right now and still get the same reaction, I'm sure.
And the fact that, you know, in this, he chooses to place himself here, right? Like there's something very different about choosing to put oneself on display.
Yes, and that reclaiming of power, I love it. And I should have said that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right, like it's powerful.
That's why we're in dialogue, because we learn together.
Exactly.
Yes.
So this is Lalo Franco, and he's been an activist in NAGPRA, and I'm going to get to what NAGPRA is here in a second. So if you're still not sure, like, don't worry, we're getting there. But I've worked with Lalo on different repatriations, and so he says he's a cultural heritage director of the Tachi Yokut tribe, which is also in California, calls the bones, and I often don't call our people in this presentation in NAGPRA bones. We call them ancestors because we don't want to normalize them being just an object. Calls bones, and he's critiquing that as well. Current resting place, a dungeon, and the scientists who took them are grave robbers with a license. And so he is specifically in this instant, it's from a article, but he's specifically talking about Berkeley and talking about where they end up keeping us. So they're always in basements. Every actually repository I've been to that holds Native remains in universities have always been basements. So usually like you're getting the classes taught. I've been in classrooms being taught anthropology and having those remains underneath me and not knowing it like until I was about to graduate, finding out like, oh, actually you're in the same building with your ancestors that no one's ever told you about. And so I love the way he kind of talks back to that and says that it's grave robbers with a license. And he's specifically talking about archaeology. So I use this quote also a lot because I feel like it really kind of talks about what we were talking about earlier, especially Dr. Blaylock's experience with museums. So it says, in a sense, NAGPRA is definitely a matter of religious rights and freedom, and indicates the strong emotional nature of repatriation for Native peoples. We believe that it is important to emphasize that many museums and tribes only began to interact once NAGPRA consultation was mandated, forced them to talk to us. As a consequence, for some museums and tribes, NAGPRA has truly been a transformative experience, though certainly not have all been positive. So yeah, we'll talk a lot about that. And so let's get to the point of breaking down the actual law of NAGPRA. And this can take a long time. I'm going to give you the bare bones. This is the highlighted version, so you're welcome. It took me a long time to actually understand a lot of what NAGPRA means. So when you read a law and you don't understand it, that's on purpose, right? That's on purpose of the language of the law. Only people with certain degrees can really understand it. So it took me a long time to get through this as well. But also, I think the first thing that needs to be said about NAGPRA is that it is a social justice law. Native peoples fought really hard for this law to be passed.
Yeah.
So this is what it's called. So yeah, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It's actually 31 years old now, 1990. So it's been around the block. It repatriates Native American ancestors and sacred objects to the lineal descendants. And that, my friends, is contested on every avenue. Like, can we repatriate? Do we want to repatriate? Can people take back repatriations, which means, returning? Who is a Native American? What's a Native American ancestor? How old do you have to be? Can you prove lineal descendancy without using DNA technologies? Can you prove it through paper trails? What are sacred objects? Who, so like literally this one line has so many complications.
So much power. Yeah.
So much power. And it's unfortunate because we often, as Native peoples, get fought against this law almost on every avenue of it.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about it too is, when we start talking about, wanting our ancestors and our objects repatriated to the right place, that's really important because, there's no such thing as just, American Indians or Native Americans. Like that's not a homogenous group. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of different nations of people. So it is important that we know, the actual provenance of, the ancestors and the objects that have been stolen from our spaces.
And it gets complicated.
It does, yeah, very quickly.
Especially here in California, because we have how many tribes that are federally recognized? 113, and then we have around 86 that have one time petitioned to become federally recognized. It's like 200 tribes. And let me tell you, we all intermarried, we all shared boundaries, we had shared territory sometimes, depending on what season it was. And so sometimes it gets really complicated, and sometimes, unfortunately, even tribes will be in conflict with each other, which can also hold up the process. One of the negative things about this law is that it's only allows for federally funded institutions. So if you're a private collector, if you're a private museum, aka Stanford is a private institution, it's a private university, so they do not actually have to fall under NAGPRA. Although they did repatriate, which was awesome. They repatriated their collection back to the Yurok tribe.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so we do see some beautiful examples in this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, exactly what we're talking about, right? When you look at this map, what do you see? And I make people talk to me and interact with me a bunch about over this map. And so luckily this is pre-recorded, so you get to cut that out. So what I'm saying here though, is that every single place on California has a name, has a story, has history, right?
Has a people.
And so it gets super complicated in California when we talk about NAGPRA. And of course, it's only for the federally recognized tribes. So my tribe is not federally recognized, which means my tribe actually cannot use NAGPRA. We have a state law called CalNAGPRA, which I'll get to in a second, but it's very weak. And that's another critique of NAGPRA in general, is that it has no teeth. So when people aren't complying, aren't in compliance with the law, they don't get fines or, like a slap on the wrist. Like there's nothing really there, which is very unfortunate. So this law defines a Native American person. And in the article, we talk about that being problematic, right? That you're defining who people are through this law. It actually cuts out so many other people, so many other tribes. So yeah, I don't necessarily need to read all of this, but yeah, also it includes Native Hawaiian folks within this law. So what can you claim under NAGPRA? So what ends up happening when NAGPRA was passed in 1990, it said, y'all got 10, 15 years to provide a inventory. So everyone, you need to tell us exactly what you have in your collection. For some museums and some repositories, that was very easy, right? We have 100 things, that's it, and submits it, right? Other places like Berkeley or Northridge or Chico State or other places have immense amounts of collections that they have to spend years kind of going through and submitting the inventories.
Remember, this was before we just had like really quick access, like computer databases, right? Like
that is very true. Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's still very much in its infancy at that point.
No, that's a really good point. And then as soon as the inventory goes up, people can make claims. So the tribe can make a claim, and then you can go into consultation. The problem with this, and I'm going to keep this short because this is a huge parts of the law, and you can really go down a lot of rabbit holes through these. And I recommend, if you are interested in NAGPRA, to go down them. Consultation is not defined very well in the law. And so what does consultation mean? Does that mean I shoot an email over to a tribe, no one responds to me, even though I might have sent the email to a wrong person, someone who's not in that position anymore, someone who's moved away from that area, doesn't work for the tribe anymore, and I don't get a response back, like, well, I was in consultation, right? So a lot of institutions that hold our remains and our material often will use that as an excuse, saying that we did try to do consultation.
Mm-hmm.
Other times people are very proactive and very good in interacting with tribes, right? Also, there's no funding here. There's some funding if you apply for the grants and stuff, but a lot of tribes, like, they're doing this on their own time, right? Like, they're coming out of pocket. I know my parts of my tribe that would partner with other federally recognized tribes to get NAGPRA done. Like, we'd had to spend all of our money, driving, taking time off of work, and doing these things. So it's also very cumbersome on it's also emotionally draining to go into those places. So thinking
There's
about
a lot of resources that you have to call on that aren't just there's definitely monetary resources there, but time and effort, and there's an emotional labor to it as well.
yeah, I mean, there's been plenty of times I've come out of repatriations in tears and sat in my car and feeling just the weight that I wasn't supposed to see, that I wasn't supposed to touch that person.
Yeah.
And I try to, like, counter that with, like, I'm helping them go home, but then also the emotional is extremely taxing. And so thinking about what NAGPRA covers, and it's part of my politic to not show ancestors. So throughout this whole presentation, you will not see remains. I don't like that. You can Google it and find a bunch if you want to, but for this presentation, I will not. So ancestors are the first and foremost that the law is created for and should be sought after, but there are these other list that will count under NAGPRA. So sacred objects, but again, who's calling them sacred, right? So if the tribe says everything's sacred and the anthropology department saying, oh no, traditionally this would have been sacred, I don't know, it gets complicated is what I'm saying. And so sacred items can be classified cultural patrimony, which is a little bit different. I use this picture because it's a fishing weir and it's a fishing spot, so you would own that communally than just individually, depending on tribe. People coming forward like, depending on tribe. But for this, for example, the big example I use for cultural patrimony is something that's held communally. So I have to think of a canoe that would take someone a long time to make, and the community would come together to make it. And it's usually not owned by an individual. Like, I wouldn't own a canoe, like my village would own that canoe, or my family would own that canoe, or you know what I mean? So like something that you can say is communally owned that can be repatriated. And then of course, associated and unassociated funerary objects, which are things that are placed within the grave, that sometimes that can be disassociated. And that could be from like shifting of dirt, earthquakes, depending on what the scenario is of like why that thing is not with that person anymore. So we often bury things with our dead. We have practices here and now about how we bury our dead. I know when my friend passed away when we were 21, I mean, her whole casket was riddled with like little shots of alcohol. There were so many blunts that they had to take out. Like, we also practice things that we give to our deceased, that we want them to take with them. Maybe this was a little bit better, better than just, I don't know, but I also trying to make the subject a little bit lighter, but because it is so heavy. But also we go and put flowers, on grave sites. We go back and offer things to our deceased as well. And so sometimes, obviously, flowers don't hold up in the archaeological record, but material objects will. So, okay, shifting gears again. This idea of why museums, anthropology department, archaeology departments, repositories, places of research, right? Universities have these items, have our ancestors, have our material culture, is structural and epistemological violence. And so Brittany and I make in, or Brittany Arona in the article, and I make these connections through, is that what does that mean when you are studying us, right? What does it mean when you have so much funding going into that kind of science? Then our beliefs or our epistemological views. And so what I'm saying here is that what ends up happening, especially in California, is that you have a genocide that happens in California, right? The actual physical killing of Native peoples.
Right.
And you remove them from that land, right? You're physically removing them from that land because you're killing them or you're pushing them out. And we see this throughout the United States, but here in California, they have a land grant that universities could apply for. So UC Berkeley was the first institution to get that land grant in the Bay Area, right? Very coveted real estate, to open up that first university. Which is, I mean, that's the point of us going to university. It's produces knowledge. Like that's what they're in business for, is producing knowledge. So what kind of knowledge? It's the first anthropology department to come over in California. And then it's creating and maintaining that history. So what ends up happening is that they have removed the indigenous peoples from that land. They build on that land from monies from the government. They produce knowledge without us and about us. And so even today, when you look at from the beginning of UC Berkeley to now, how many Native students they've accepted into their programs? Very low, very low. And that continues on a spectrum through the UC's system. I'm a UC product. I'm a Sac State product. Actually, the bottom picture is of me on an archaeological dig through Sac State. I was an anthropologist. I'm still an anthropologist and ethnic studies. And so luckily with this dig, this archaeological dig was also in partners with the tribe. They wanted to do some of that work, but still, right, I still feel very kind of icky about it in general.
Yeah. I mean, this is the really important thing when we start talking about issues of, representation and why representation matters, because you really said the key thing there, which was being in the business of producing knowledge, of creating knowledge. And so if that knowledge is always created only from one epistemological standpoint and is without the representation of, the peoples that it is of or about, it will always be an outside in rather than being, knowledge created with.
Perfect. Exactly. Yeah. And so thinking about who's creating that history, who's getting that funding. This has been something that's happened for a very long time, right? This isn't new. That Thomas Jefferson is kind of claimed as the first archaeologist because he dug behind his house in some of the mounds in the southeastern United States. Samuel Morton in 1840 is the first physical anthropologist who ended up collecting over 600 Native Americans, skulls. And I want you to think about this, because 1840 sounds like a long time ago, but California became a state in 1850. I think about this as how many grandmas away that was, and it's not that many grandmas away. So, for example, my dad was born in like 1948. His mom was born in like, let's say 1920s. So what, like, let's say like 4 grandmas ago, right? Like that's not that long. We are still very close to genocide in this state. And so seeing this, that how many of our people have been sent across seas to be studied as well. And it was for, to make scientific racism, right? That's proved. They would use skeletons to prove who was superior and who was lower. Right. Often saying that white was superior. Franz Boas, That guy, we can talk about that guy forever. But Alfred Kroeber is who you need to know. Out of all this list, Alfred Kroeber is the one that you should know about. He's the one who was a student of Franz Boas, but he started the anthropology department in Berkeley in California. And he was so worried that California Indians were going to die out. We're all going to die out. We're all going to leave, right? He called it salvage ethnography, that he wanted and focused that whole department on writing down every last thing about Native peoples. He was not interested in any Native person who was a part of the culture of, the United States, that had assimilated, that had, if they weren't traditional, is what I'm saying. And so if they weren't traditional, he would excuse them and like not write about them. But it really shows that like he was only interested in one type of person, like that we weren't also changing.
Yeah, he only wanted that historical monolith of a Native person.
Yeah, like I got this from Express, y'all. Like, just like, so I don't look Native now because I'm not in this particular way that you think I should be in. And this is exactly part of that narrative. That's why it's still happening now. So this idea of pot hunters, people going in, that it was part of the United States past. So they also like private pot hunters and collectors would do this, go out and feel very connected to this narrative. Like I'm American, so this is also part of my past, like feel like this claim to it as well. So I've heard stories of this. It's very disturbing. I've had someone named Cowboy, mind you, tell me that his uncle had dug up skeletons on the river, and then said, don't worry, he put him back because he had bad dreams. And I'm like, thank you. But this violence that continue is like replicated here. And then of course collectors and people would collect our stuff as decorations. And so sometimes you see like some of our most sacred objects out of our hands, like we have no access to them, but they'll be sitting on someone's mantle. So if y'all have a basket around your house, contact me. So yeah, so CalNAGPRA is for non-federally recognized tribes, but has never been used. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but I wanted to let people know that there was something for non-federally recognized tribes, because in California there's so many, but there was no funding. It's under the Heritage Commission, so it's very weak, unfortunately, and again, it's never actually been used. So unfortunate. So I'm going to shift now to some more like court cases about NAGPRA. Did you want to add anything before we moved into this?
No, let's talk about Juana the Bear.
Who, Juana the Bear? Y'all, I did not know about this. See, this is the thing I love about research. Like, and people that watch presentations think that they know all these things. Like, I learned this for the first time before too, right? Like, I wasn't born with this information, and like a ton of bricks. So Juana the Bear is actually from I think he's Maidu, or no, he's Miwok. He's Miwok. And there was forced removal in California, right? As we all know. Then there's this development structure that happened. And I want to say this is around Stockton area, Modesto, Stockton area in California. And there was this huge development because they wanted to put in tract housing. And what ends up happening is that the construction started and they started to find remains, because you're going to find remains in California. And a 1854 act held that a place where 6 bodies were buried constituted as a public graveyard. So if there was any place, so right, this is an old law, saying if there was more than 6, it counted as a public graveyard. But of course, when Juana the Bear tried to use this, it didn't count. Why? Like, why did it not count for Juana the Bear's tribe? So in 1872, a new act added a prescriptive clause that required the land be used as a public cemetery continuously without interruption as a burial ground for 5 years. And so because of the removal, because of the forced relocation of the Miwok tribe, the government said that you haven't used this burial ground continuously. How could they? How could they, when they were running for their lives in 1850, how could they stick up for this burial site? And it's so disturbing when you see these statistics, right? I was just saying, like, over and over again, us again and again being defenseless and powerless when it comes to our dead. Echo Hawk actually wrote the chapter on this, and he writes, each tribe suffered an invasion of body snatchers of every deception: tourists, developers, pot hunters, treasure seekers, amateur or professional archaeologists, museum collecting crews, soldiers, and federal agencies. So it wasn't just anthropology, it wasn't just pot hunter, right? You see it over and over in all of these fields,
Right.
in all of these ways. He goes on through 10. I'm not going to go through all 10, but these are often the excuses people hold, right? When they talk about NAGPRA, when they talk about repatriating. For whatever reason, museums often feel a connection to what they've collected. They feel ownership over it, and they often don't want to give it back. There are huge amounts of examples of people not wanting to participate in repatriation, and these are the excuses that they often give, right? It's a national resource. It's all of our history, you know, which is extremely problematic when the people whose history it is can't even access it. The past belongs to all, right? The future, for future studies. So the future studies, and this is the example I'm going to give you, and then I'll move on from here, but it's kind of my favorite.
All right. Why is it your favorite?
So I went to an anthropology presentation, and this anthropologist had said he had spent 8 years, I mean, from a university. So imagine how much funding he got over those 8 years to look at what California Indians ate in Northern California. And so he looked a lot of the teeth, the dental records, the all kinds of the kind of testing. I forget the names of all of them. And you know what he came up with? His findings was that California Indians ate salmons and acorns.
Okay. And nothing else.
I remember just sitting there thinking, I was like, I can get funding to help my tribe get federally recognized that will actually help my tribe like so much. Salmons and acorns, y'all. He could have asked any living Indian what we ate.
And the list would have been bigger than salmon and acorns, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he probably has more on his list, but
Sure.
those were the two number ones, right? And it's like, yeah, we know, we still do.
Yeah, these are resources that still exist. These are practices that still exist.
Yeah, and so we see, you can go down this list and of course talk about each one of these in length, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's really this upsetting way of which people feel entitled to us. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Berkeley because Berkeley's the worst, and Berkeley knows it's the worst actually, which is kind of hilarious. Like they even apologize for themselves. I know a lot of people that work actually at Berkeley in their collections and say, oh, I know. But anyways, yeah, they have over 10,000 Indian skeletons and many of them complete. I've been to Berkeley. It is a horrific sight of seeing so much. I didn't see the people, but I've seen the baskets and the amounts of baskets they have, rows on rows and rows of basketry. But they actually treated them with DDT, so you're not allowed to touch them. So imagine having so much at your fingertips, but not being able to touch our sacred items.
And that's exactly what those items are for, right? Like these are not objects that were made just to be looked at. These were objects that were made as part of our daily lives, as part of our ceremonies.
Our birthright. I mean, the basket you have in the back of your background, right? And so when they say they put them on these shelves, they get dried out. They actually want our nasty little greasy fingers on them. Like they're materials, right? So they want to be in water, soaked every once in a while. And so they get so brittle. And now that these ones are toxic, we can't physically touch them at all. So disturbing. But the campaign that came out of Berkeley, which is something that I think really radiates in my body when I hear it, and every time I say it out loud, it makes my hair stand up. But right, we all go to campuses that have more dead Native peoples than alive.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what that says to you, like, but it says a lot to me to be in a room or be in a university. And I'm like, I know for a fact they have more dead Indians on campus
Than live ones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And y'all ain't no better. It's okay. I come for Chico too. They don't like me for it, but it's okay. And this is something that is very accessible. via the NAGPRA website. So they have a national NAGPRA website, and you can go into their databases and look up wherever you're at, you can look this up. And so the MNI is the minimum, oh, what is it? I forget the acronym. Do you remember it? Oh, it's like the minimum number of individuals. Oh, I got it. Minimum number.
Okay. Yeah.
The AFO is like associated funerary objects. Oh, check me out. Bam, bam, bam.
You got it.
And these are just human remains, right? So there's a lot more in the ways of cultural objects. So, I mean, what does it say to you?
So what is that number down there for Northridge right now, based off of the reported inventory?
So I don't filter, no, it doesn't count it. So we can count real fast: 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 35, 36, 37, 37.
37. And then it's like thousands down there, right? Thousands of associated objects.
Yeah, and I feel like this is always really shocking in any presentation when we realize that we're also at an institution that is problematic about NAGPRA. And there is actually a really huge story that happened in California that we're going to talk about that actually started with Northridge. And I didn't know that at the time when I wrote the article. I actually talked about this case, but I did not know it started here.
All right, so let's drop some CSUN knowledge.
And unfortunately, like, right, these are the cliff notes again. So Northridge in 1976, their archaeology students went and exhumed a site because the chancellor at the time, they were going to put in this brand new, sparkling, fantastic, top of the notch house. I believe it's actually on San Diego territory, or University of San Diego, and yeah, right, for this mansion for the chancellor to do. I believe it's set for like fundraising and events. Well, anyways, the archaeology student, of course, they found remains. The archaeology department from Northridge went out there and exhumed the peoples from there. So there's actually a lot more peoples that were pulled out of that grave site. But unfortunately, well, the part of what we're talking about here is the 3 individuals that are Kumeyaay. And there's 3 individuals here. That's the crux of this whole case. And Northridge ends up, I guess, giving the remains, because the remains were on San Diego territory, to, right, UC San Diego. And the Kumeyaay made the claim, like, no, we want our ancestors back. And the problem here, or one of the big issues, was that these ancestors were so old that they're actually some of the oldest remains found in the United States. And so the Kumeyaay said, we want them back. And UC said, no, we don't want to give them back to you. So that turns out to this really huge legal situation, and deemed them culturally unidentifiable. And this is something that I think I failed to make clear in the beginning parts of this presentation. But culturally unidentifiable means that we can't for sure 100% culturally identify these remains to go back to this tribe. And who makes that decision? It's not the tribe, right? It's the anthropologists. But if the anthropologists have the power and want to keep the remains, why would they have any incentive to make them culturally identifiable? The law actually got shifted a little bit later on. God, I want to say around 2000s, about this, specifically about culturally unidentifiable, which loosens up the law a little bit. Easier for people to make things culturally identifiable, but people still lean a lot on determining remains. We don't know where they came from. What do you mean? I love the fact that in this article, it talks about the Black Student Union and the Native student activists coming together. And that is something that I think that is often not talked about, that we've always been an allyship, been an allyship with each other. And it's not talked about. It's always like, this is a Native issue, so it's Native people. It's a human rights issue, right? This is a human's right issue of collecting remains. So you don't need to be Native to fight for this. I always get people at the end of the presentation, like, oh, what are you gonna do next? I'm like, what are you gonna do? And I love it that the Black Student Union stood up and also made demands of saying that this is not okay, the way you are treating the Kumeyaay Nation. And another Native student who like went around and collected like 100 signatures, right? So we can make a change. And so this is from The Guardian. This is from the article itself. And it says, because Northridge archaeology students discovered the remains on the university property, they were currently under the UC control, right? So Northridge had to give them over. Stored in a safe at San Diego Archaeological Center in Escondido. So again, with the basement stuff and putting them in a safe, and like, why do you want to continue to keep them? Why can't you just let them go home? Right? It's this weird thing, like people want to just keep us on shelves. They want us to be accessible anytime they want to see us. And we have no power to stop that. That's scary. So since their discovery, the artifacts have been shipped to various locations across the country, displayed at prestigious museums like the Smithsonian, and studied with a particular scrutiny of their age. Yeah, it's so much, and it's so upsetting. All amid pleas by local American Indians, specifically Kumeyaay, to have the ancestral remains returned and reburied. What ends up happening is that NAGPRA gets involved, all of these things get involved, and 3 UC professors, one in which where Dr. Blaylock and I both went to UC Davis, and that's Robert Bettinger. I will call him out anywhere I go. And then Tim White, and then Margaret Sosinger sued the university because the university was going to give the remains back to the Kumeyaay. They sued the university because they said it infringed on their academic freedom to research. Sued.
Wow.
To keep the remains. It's upsetting. So refused to comment on the case, but in a letter published in this magazine, it pretty much said that the UC professors in a legal battle didn't want them returned. I actually don't know for sure if they were returned. I think they were returned eventually. But yeah, just the fight. And I mean,
and think about the fight that the Kumeyaay have right now, right? Like they're still fighting for the rights of their ancestors with the border wall, which is digging up and destroying these sites. Like one of those sites could very well be like a reburial site for some of these ancestors that we're talking about right now. And yet the nation state is still coming in and imposing and destroying.
There was an example of some researchers, some young Native researchers who said they wanted to research a pioneer gravesite and put in an application to go dig up a pioneer gravesite, and people were up in arms, like, and they're like, exactly. So this is the example I use in the chapter, and the one I will end us with, but I think it takes us home pretty full circle, if you will. So we see here, this is Tuluwat. This is it's called Indian Island, which of course is because for the erasure of Native peoples, right, is erasing their language and their, names of land. So the Wiyot people from Northern California, they used Tuluwat as a sacred place. That's their sacred, where they do their ceremonies. And in 1860, right, 50 years after California became a state, where we were being massacred left and right. There are so many massacres that happened. And right here in 1860, they did a world renewal ceremony, which seems like, it seems like it was needed. And when they were on the island, they were massacred. They actually end up killing a lot of people that day. There's a story that Kutcher Baldy actually talks about it, but how there's actually records of that massacre, and one woman who survived just kept singing. She just kept singing. Yeah. And so anyways, after 1860, that massacre, the Wiyot were removed pushed out of the area. Some were able to still stay, but majority of them were pushed out to, the reservation systems. And the island then starts becoming known as Indian Island, which, is further racist. And then it ends up going over to the city of Humboldt or Arcata. And what ends up happening 63 years later, only 63 years later, and people forget about this in NAGPRA, that it's always so close. It's not that far that they're, using the remains that are thousands of years old, like the Kumeyaay example. This one, 63 years later, H.H. Stewart, who was a dentist. This guy was a dentist. And I love it because like people always think about people being bad, like it's a negative thing. Like, no, these were dentists. These were like people who were lawyers. These were people who like, right? People that we would think that are, pillars of the community, right? Like they were also part of this. In 1923, got permission to go set up on the island, and he excavated over 382 graves. And you know what he did? He sent them back to UC Berkeley because that was the first university. So we see what I'm saying in the Brittany and I saying in this whole article is that we're making California a white possession. That not only was there the genocide, it was the removal of our bodies from the land, like removing us from the land. Like, because Natives, being an Indigenous person, is so dangerous to the nation state because we are alive, we have stakes to the claims to land because we've never ceded land to them.
Right.
We have claims to land that they don't want to recognize. That's why blood quantum's incorporated, so it always breeds us out. Or at the same time, like they don't want to see us
continue.
And so the fact that they've not only through the massacres removed indigenous bodies from the land, like that's really part of the nation state. And so then giving it back to UC Berkeley to then study us. And UC Berkeley has never once done NAGPRA. They're in compliance because we're looking at a law, right? Still a law from the government to protect our own rights. It's a continual cycle of powerlessness in this way.
Yeah. So I mean, like, Native bodies, I think people are really familiar with things like the Trail of Tears and Native peoples being removed to reservations or rancherias or even missions. When we're talking about here in California, these are live people who are being relocated to another space. But here we're talking about the fact that they've done the same thing with our ancestors, with our dead. It's not just live Native peoples that are a threat. It's actually the state saying that dead Indians are a threat too.
Oh, yep. I should use that as a quote. That was good. But it's so true. But in every presentation that I do or wherever I go, I always end with saying that it doesn't stop us.
Yeah.
That we're still not just surviving, we're thriving. We're out here killing the game, look at us, bling. Look at the bling. Since year one, y'all. So yeah, that we will continue. The end of the article, I'm not going to go through all of these, don't worry, but these were the suggestions to think about ways in which we can do this work better. To start thinking forward or toward working with NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA Museums Institution to get our ancestors back. And so I think I'm not going to go through this, but the point of it is listening to what we want. And sometimes, we can go down all of these holes, but just give us back. Just give it back. I mean, someone watching this presentation will eventually be on the Supreme Court, I'm pretty sure. So hopefully you'll remember this presentation some point later on, or have the power to be in the conversations or at the tables where these decisions are being made and stepping up and saying, how about we just give them back? And people will be scared and they'll say, no, we can't. And you can be like, yes, we can. We can.